Alright, let's go. Number 12. Göbekli Tepe and the skulls that were carved to hang in the dark. In 2009, an anthropologist named Julia Greski, working for the German Archaeological Institute, began the slow and unglamorous task of cataloging human bone pulled from the fill of the oldest monumental architecture on Earth. The site was Göbekli Tepe, the ring of carved limestone pillars rising out of a dusty hill in southeastern Turkey that the archaeologist Klaus Schmidt had been excavating since the mid-1990s. Out of roughly 700 fragments of human bone recovered from the rubble, more than half came from skulls. 3 of those fragments did not look like the others. They had been cut. Deep grooves ran front to back along the curve of the cranium gouged into the bone with flint tools, and on the best preserved piece, there was something else, a small drilled perforation near the crown of the head about 5 millimeters across, accompanied by faint traces of red ochre. Greski, working with Julian Helm and Lee Clare, published the analysis in the journal Science Advances in June of 2017. Using microscopic techniques, they ruled out animal gnawing. They ruled out scalping because the carvings were far too deep and too deliberate for that. And critically, the grooves had been cut into bone that had already been stripped of its flesh. These were not wounds. They were modifications made carefully after death. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are around 11,000 years old. Measure that against what came afterward. This predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000. It predates the invention of pottery, the invention of writing, the invention of the wheel. The people who carved these skulls had not yet invented farming. The purpose of that drilled hole is where the discovery turns dark. It was placed exactly where a cord would need to pass for the skull to hang level, balanced face forward. The bone had been prepared to be suspended from a wooden beam, perhaps, or a post, or the researchers allow from one of the great T-shaped pillars themselves. And the carved imagery at the site echoes the bone. One statue recovered at Göbekli Tepe is missing its head, apparently on purpose. Another, which excavators call the gift bearer, depicts a figure cradling a human head in its hands. We'd like to imagine the deep past as a slow, hopeful climb towards sophistication, with ritual and meaning arriving late after the harvests and the cities. Göbekli Tepe turns that story upside down. Before farming, before permanent villages, before any of the markers we use to define civilization, human beings were gathering at this hilltop, hauling 20-ton pillars into place, and curating the skulls of the dead, cleaning them, marking them, hanging them in the air. Whether the heads belong to honored ancestors kept close, or to enemies put on grim display, the evidence cannot yet tell us. The carvings are crude and hurried, which somehow makes them worse, not better. They left no words, only the grooves and the single drilled hole and the certainty that the dead were meant to be seen. We do not know by whom. We do not know why. And we do not know what those suspended faces were meant to watch over from their place above the oldest temple in the world. Number 11. The city of Jericho and the faces they rebuilt out of plaster. In 1953, the British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon was digging through the deepest, oldest layers of Tel Sultan, the great mound beside the springs of Jericho in the Jordan Valley. She had reached strata laid down before pottery, before the plow, a Neolithic world some 9,500 years old. There in the dirt beneath, where houses had once stood, she found a group of 7 human skulls, and each one had been given back its face. The flesh was long gone, of course. What Kenyon's team uncovered was the work that had been done after the flesh was gone. The lower jaw had been removed. The empty cranium had been packed with soil to support the delicate facial bones, and then wet plaster had been modeled over the front of the skull, sculpted into cheeks, a nose, a brow, the structure of a living human face. The eye sockets were filled with cowrie shells, set into the plaster so that the skull seemed to look back at whoever held it. Some of the skulls carried traces of red and black paint. Some had hair painted on. The most famous of them now in the British Museum is considered the oldest portrait in the collection and the man it portrays had a deliberately reshaped head, bound and flattened in infancy, marking him as somebody set apart from the time he was a child. Kenyon thought when she first lifted one of these objects from the ground that she was looking at a portrait of someone who had lived and died thousands of years before her. She was not wrong. In the decades since, more than 50 of these plastered skulls have been found scattered across the Neolithic Near East. The practice was widespread, and it was patient, and it lasted for generations. The relationship it implies between the living and the dead is not one we would share. At Jericho, people buried their family members beneath the floors of their own homes. They lived directly on top of their dead. And sometimes after the body had decomposed in the earth below, they went back down, retrieved the skull, and brought it up into the household to be remade, to be displayed, to be kept. The dead were not sent away. They were curated. They were furnished with new faces and seated among the living, looking out through shells. We talk about ancestor worship as an abstraction, a category in a textbook. Jericho makes it physical. These were not symbols of ancestors. They were the actual heads of actual grandparents and parents dug up, sculpted, painted, and placed where the family could see them every day. The work is tender. The care taken with each face is obvious. And that tenderness is exactly what disturbs, because it means the boundary we draw so firmly between the living and the dead. The boundary that lets us bury someone and walk away simply was not there. The shells stare out of the plaster blind and patient from the springs of one of the oldest cities humanity ever built. Whose faces these were meant to be is lost to us. What survives is the care that someone loved them enough to give them back. Number 10. The Chinchorro and the bodies they took apart to keep forever. Along the coast of the Atacama Desert, in what is now northern Chile and southernmost Peru, lived a people who made the oldest, deliberately preserved human bodies on Earth. We call them the Chinchorro, after a beach near the city of Arica, and they were not kings or priests with great tombs. They were hunter-gatherers and fishermen, and roughly 7,000 years ago, some 2,000 years before the first Egyptian mummy, they began doing something to their dead that no one before them is known to have done. The Chilean physical anthropologist Bernardo Arriaza of the University of Tarapacá has spent decades reconstructing how it was done publishing on the subject since the 1980s. The process was not preservation as we picture it. It was disassembly and reconstruction. The body was taken apart. The internal organs were removed, the soft tissue stripped. Sometimes the skin peeled away to be set aside. The skeleton was then reinforced from the inside with sticks and reeds and clay, rebuilt into a standing armature of a human being. The skin was reattached. The face was covered with a clay mask, and the whole figure was coated in the earliest style with a black paste of manganese, and later after around 4,500 years ago with brilliant red ochre. These are the oldest artificial mummies in the world, and they predate the pharaohs by millennia. UNESCO recognized the Chinchorro sites as a World Heritage Landscape only in 2021, validating what specialists had argued for a generation, that a small band of desert fishermen had developed one of the most elaborate mortuary technologies in human prehistory. But here is where the familiar image of mummies as the privilege of the powerful falls apart. The Chinchorro mummified everyone. Men, women, the elderly, and above all the very young newborns, infants, even unborn fetuses were given the full painstaking treatment. There was no hierarchy in it, and Arriaza has proposed a reason that turns the whole practice from morbid craft into something almost unbearably human. The rivers in this region, particularly around the Camarones Valley, carried naturally high levels of arsenic. Arsenic in the water causes miscarriage and kills infants. These communities were burying their children at devastating rates. His argument is that mummification began as grief. It began with parents who could not bear to let go, who painted their dead children, dressed them, kept them present, and that the technique grew more elaborate over centuries because the loss never stopped. The mummies were not sealed away. They were maintained, repainted when the color faded, even repaired, and carried on reed litters to remain present among the living. A dead child was not removed from the family. The dead child was kept. We invented mummification. It turns out not for god kings reaching for eternity, but for ordinary people who had lost too many of their own. The oldest preserved bodies on the planet are mostly small ones. They stand now in museum cases in the driest desert in the world. Black and red, and silent the faces of children whose parents refused 7,000 years ago to say goodbye. Number 9. Catalhoyuk, and the houses built on top of the dead. In 1958, on a plain in central Anatolia, the archaeologist James Mellart began uncovering one of the earliest large settlements human beings ever made, a honeycomb of mud brick houses, packed so tightly together that there were no streets between them. People entered their homes through holes in the roofs and walked across the rooftops of the entire town. We call it Catalhoyuk, and at its height, between roughly 7,000 and 6,000 years before the Common Era. It held thousands of people. Decades later, from 1993 to 2018, the British archaeologist Ian Hodder, based at Stanford, led a long and meticulous re-excavation that revealed what these people did with their dead. They kept them in the house. At Catalhoyuk, the dead were buried beneath the floors under the raised platforms where the living slept. A body would be placed in a pit, dug into the floor of the home sometimes, after the flesh had already been allowed to decay elsewhere, and then the family went on living above it. In one building, Hodder's team found the remains of around 20 individuals, interred beneath a single floor. These houses occupied by the living were also tombs, and the two functions were not kept apart. They were the same thing. And then there are the skulls. As at Jericho, the people of Catalhoyuk sometimes returned to a buried body, removed the head, and brought it back into circulation. In 2004, excavators found the single plastered and painted skull ever recovered from the site, and they found it cradled in the arms of another body, an older woman buried holding the remade head of someone who had died before her. The skull had been passed down. It had outlived at least one generation and been placed at last in the embrace of the next. The walls of these houses were stranger still, set into them plastered over and often painted red. With ochre were the horned skulls of wild aurochs, enormous, now extinct cattle, their horns projecting out into the living space. Archaeologists call these installations bucrania. A family might share its main room with rows of bullhorns thrusting from the walls and benches with the skulls of the human dead beneath the floor in a single continuous environment of the living, the slaughtered, and the ancestral. Step back, and the practice becomes a statement about memory. Hodder has argued that certain houses functioned as what he calls history, houses dwellings where the dead were concentrated, where skulls were retrieved and curated and handed down, where the identity of a lineage was physically anchored in the building itself. To belong somewhere was to live on top of your dead, surrounded by the heads of bulls and grandparents in a house that remembered. There is no separation here that we would recognize. No graveyard at the edge of town. No threshold between the place you sleep and the place the dead lie. The people of Catalhoyuk built their lives directly onto the bodies of those they had lost, decorated the walls with the dead of two species, and passed the skulls of their ancestors from one set of arms to the next across the generations. Whatever they understood about the dead, it did not involve letting them leave. Number 8. Herxheim and the 500 who were broken into pieces. In 1996, in the Palatinate region of southwestern Germany, a construction project broke ground and began turning up human bone. The site was Herxheim, and what emerged from it over the following years through a rescue excavation and then a fuller campaign led by Andrea Zieblantz and Fabian Hack is one of the most contested and disturbing deposits in all of European prehistory. It dates to around 5,000 years before the Common Era. To the very end of the culture, archaeologists call the linear pottery culture the first farmers of Central Europe. The remains belonged to a minimum of 500 individuals. Some estimates run past 1,000. They were not laid out in graves. They had been shattered and scattered through a series of pits that ringed the settlement mixed together fragmented, deliberately reduced. Newborns, children, adults, the elderly, an entire cross-section of human beings, broken apart and deposited. In 2009, the anthropologist Bruno Bulestein and his colleagues published an analysis in the journal Antiquity that named what the bones appeared to show. The skulls had been worked into a recurring standardized form, the cranial vault carefully separated to make what researchers describe as skull caps or cups. The long bones had been broken open in the way one breaks bone to extract marrow. There were cut marks consistent with the removal of muscle, and damage of the kind produced when ribs are separated from the spine in butchery. The treatment of the human bodies, Bulestein argued, closely matched the treatment of butchered animals found at the same site. His conclusion was cannibalism. Mass cannibalism carried out over a short span, perhaps only a few decades. To grasp the scale, look at the pottery found among the bones. Some of it came from places up to 400 kilometers away. People, or bodies, or both were converging on this single location from across an enormous stretch of Neolithic Europe, and what happened to them there left their skulls shaped into cups. The interpretation, though, is fiercely contested, and that has to be said. Other respected researchers, among them Jörg Orschiet and Miriam Heidel, have argued that the damage need not mean cannibalism at all. It could represent an intense, violent form of secondary burial bodies brought from far away, processed and ritually deposited as part of some funerary or crisis response without anyone consuming them. The bones can be read more than one way, and that has to be acknowledged. But the disagreement does not dissolve the strangeness. It deepens it. Because under either reading, something extraordinary and dark was happening at Herxheim at the moment the first farming culture of Europe collapsed. Either hundreds of people were consumed in a sustained ritual, or hundreds of bodies were carried across the continent to be smashed into fragments and laid in pits. Neither is ordinary. Neither is gentle. And both happened at a threshold, the end of a world. The dissolution of a way of life that had spread across Europe, and then around 5,000 years before the Common Era came apart. What drove them to it is beyond recovery now. Famine wore a collapse of belief, a ritual whose logic is lost completely. What remains are the pits, the standardized skull caps, and the bones of 500 human beings, broken with the same care one uses on an animal. They were processed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The knowing is the part that stays with you. Number 7. Cahokia's Mound, 72, and the women who were buried by the dozen. Across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis once stood the largest city in North America, north of Mexico. We call it Cahokia, and 1,000 years ago it was a metropolis of earthen pyramids and tens of thousands of people. In the 1960s, the archaeologist Melvin Fowler excavated one of its smaller mounds, a low ridge designated Mound 72. What he found inside it is among the clearest evidence of large-scale human sacrifice anywhere in the ancient Americas. At the heart of the mound lay two central individuals, placed upon a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads, arranged in the shape of a bird, the famous beaded burial. For decades, this was read as the grave of a great male warrior chief and his companion. More recent analysis led by Thomas Emerson of the Illinois State Archaeological Survey and published in the journal American Antiquity in 2016 complicated that story considerably. The central pairing includes a man and a woman, and the surrounding high-status burials include both sexes and a child. But it is what lay around these central figures that turns the stomach. In separate pits within the same mound were mass graves. One held more than 50 young women laid out in neat rows. Another contained people who had been violently killed. Some apparently bled to death, some decapitated, thrown in without ceremony. The young women in the orderly graves ranged in age from about 15 to 25, and showed no marks on the bone to reveal how they died, which itself points toward methods that leave no trace strangulation perhaps, or poisoning, or the cutting of the throat. The numbers are hard to hold. In a single mound in a society without writing or metal tools, hundreds of people had been killed and arranged around a handful of elites. And the sacrifices were not a single catastrophic event. The neatly ordered graves of young women represent a practice that was repeated generation after generation as part of the ceremonial order of the city. Then, the chemistry changed the meaning entirely. Researchers, including the physical anthropologist Kristen Hedman, analyzed strontium isotopes in the teeth of the dead. Strontium is absorbed from the local bedrock through food and water, and it leaves a geological fingerprint in the body that marks where a person grew up. For a long time, it was assumed the sacrificial victims were outsiders' captives, tribute strangers brought in to die. The isotopes said otherwise. The young women in the mass graves were for the most part local. They had grown up in and around Cahokia itself. So this was not the killing of enemies. These were the city's own daughters, raised within sight of the mounds, selected and killed and buried by the dozen in service of a ritual whose meaning died with the city. We cannot ask them what they were told it was for. We cannot ask whether they went willingly or in terror. We can only count the rows. They lie there still beneath a grassy ridge in Illinois that most people drive past without a glance. More than 50 young women in a single pit who grew up in the greatest city their continent had ever produced and were buried by it. Number 6. Pömmelte, and the bodies thrown into the shafts. In 1991, an aerial photograph of farmland in Saxony-Anhalt in eastern Germany revealed the ghost of an enormous circular structure pressed into the soil. Concentric rings of ditches and banks and post holes more than 100 meters across. It came to be called the German Stonehenge, or by its proper name, the Ringheiligtum Pömmelte. It was built around the same time as the Great Stone Circle in England, roughly 4,300 years ago, at the transition from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age. And like Stonehenge, it was a place of ritual, rather than a place to live. It was a place where things were given to the earth. From 2005 to 2008, excavations led by André Spazier of the State Office for Cultural Heritage in Baden-Württemberg, working with François Bertham of Martin Luther University in Halle, investigated the 29 shaft-like pits sunk into the ground within the rings. They published their findings in the journal Antiquity in 2018. In the earliest phase of the monument, radiocarbon dated to around 2,300 years before the Common Era. The pits had been filled with deliberately broken objects, smashed drinking vessels, stone axes, grinding stones, the butchered bones of cattle, all destroyed before being thrown in. This was a place where you broke valuable things on purpose and committed them to the dark. And among the broken pottery and the smashed axes were people. The shafts held the dismembered bodies of 10 women and children. They had not been buried. They had been thrown in their remains arranged in the contorted positions of bodies that fell or were dropped rather than laid to rest. Most of the children and adolescents were between 3 and 17 years old. 4 of the victims showed severe fractures to the skull and ribs injuries sustained at or near the time of death. One teenager had been bound, the hands tied together, before the body went into the pit. To understand what that means, look at what lay on the other side of the monument. In the eastern half of the rings, the excavators found a different kind of burial. Entirely 13 adult men interred carefully formally, with their skulls oriented toward the rising sun. The men were given dignity. They were laid out facing the sunrise. The women and children were broken and discarded into shafts alongside the ritually smashed pottery treated in death, as offerings, rather than as people to be mourned. And the evidence refuses to give a comfortable answer. The researchers themselves are careful to say, it remains unclear whether these individuals were ritually sacrificed or whether they died in some episode of raiding and intergroup violence and were then deposited here. But the contrast is the thing that haunts. The same community that buried its men facing the dawn threw its women and children into pits with the trash of a broken feast. Whatever logic governed that division, it was a logic in which certain human beings were valuables to be destroyed and given away, no different in kind from a shattered cup or a slaughtered cow. The monument was eventually decommissioned, with ceremony around 2,050 years before the Common Era, the posts pulled out, and the wood burned and the whole structure formally closed. For 4,000 years, it lay invisible beneath a field. And when it was opened again, the shafts gave up their offerings, a bound teenagers 4 people, with shattered skulls, 10 women and children face down in the dark beside the broken things. Number 5. Sunghir and the children buried like gods. About 150 kilometers east of Moscow, on the outskirts of the Russian city of Vladimir, lies one of the most extraordinary burials of the Ice Age. The site is called Sunghir, and it was excavated between 1957 and 1977 under the Soviet archaeologist Otto Bader. The remains date to around 34,000 years ago, deep in the Upper Paleolithic, when this part of the world was open, mammoth steppe, and the people who lived there were hunters of enormous animals in a frozen land. And in one long, narrow grave, those hunters buried 2 children with a wealth that defies comprehension. The 2 were placed head to head, skull touching skull, in a single slender pit. They were perhaps 10 and 12 years old, and they had been covered quite literally in treasure. Across the 2 small bodies, researchers counted more than 10,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory, sewn so densely that they must once have covered whole garments. There were more than 20 ivory armbands. There were around 300 pierced fox teeth, and a belt strung with the canine teeth of some 250 Arctic foxes. There were carved ivory animals, an ivory pendant in the shape of a mammoth, and 2 human thigh bones packed with red ochre laid across the children's chests. And then there are the spears. Beside the bodies lay 16 lances of mammoth ivory. The longest of them measures nearly 2.5 meters, and it was made from the tusk of a mammoth that had somehow been straightened. A curved tusk worked into a straight shaft, a feat of craft whose method we still do not fully understand. Consider the labor. Experimental estimates suggest that a single one of those ivory beads took something on the order of 45 minutes to an hour to carve. 10,000 beads. That is thousands upon thousands of hours of work, months of human effort by skilled hands in a brutal climate where survival was never guaranteed, poured into the graves of 2 children. And then there is the question of who the children were. The remains were studied in detail by Eric Trinkaus of Washington University in St. Louis, together with Alexandra Buzilova of Moscow State University, and reported again in the journal Antiquity in 2018. Both children, the analysis showed, were physically disabled. One had thigh bones that were severely bowed and abnormally short. The other appears to have been bedridden, possibly from birth. The teeth show almost no wear, which hints that the group had been feeding this child soft food, keeping a profoundly disabled member of the band alive year after year. Meanwhile, an adult man buried at the same site, a man who in life could hunt and provide and contribute, went into the ground with a fraction of the riches, a few thousand beads, and far less besides. This overturns a comfortable assumption about the Ice Age. The idea that in a world that harsh status had to be earned, that the weak were left behind, that only the strong and useful were honored. At Sunghir, the opposite is written in ivory. 2 children who could not hunt, who could barely move, who in some grim calculus were a burden on a struggling band, were sent into death, wrapped in more wealth than anyone else at the site. They were not abandoned. They were exalted. What those children meant to the people who carved 10,000 beads for them is beyond us. Whether they were loved or feared or believed to be touched by something the others could not see, we cannot say. Only one thing is certain. 34,000 years ago, in the cold, human beings looked at 2 disabled children and decided they were worth everything they had. Number 4. Shanidar and the Neanderthals who would not leave their dead. In a cave in the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan between 1951 and 1960, the American archaeologist Ralph Selecki uncovered the remains of 10 Neanderthals men, women, and infants who had died there tens of thousands of years ago. The site is called Shanidar, and one of those individuals, the adult male designated Shanidar 4, would become the most famous Neanderthal burial ever found, and the spark for an argument that has not ended in more than half a century. Because around the body of Shanidar 4, the soil told a strange story. When the paleobotanist Arlette Leroy-Gourhan analyzed pollen samples taken from the grave, she found something unexpected, not the scattered ordinary pollen you would expect blown into a cave, but whole clumps of it from several species of flowering plants concentrated around the body. Selecki drew the conclusion that captured the world's imagination. The Neanderthals he proposed had laid this man to rest on a bed of flowers. They had grieved. They had performed a funeral. The implication detonated a stereotype. Neanderthals had been imagined as brutish, dim, barely human, and here was a sign that they buried their dead with tenderness, with ceremony, with flowers gathered from the hillsides. Place that in time, it happened on the order of 70,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before our own species would paint a cave wall in Europe. It suggested that the capacity for grief, for ritual, for love extended past the boundaries of Homo sapiens, entirely into a different kind of human. But here is where the certainty gives way to serious doubt, and the doubts are not trivial. Critics pointed out that pollen can be carried into a cave by burrowing rodents. A Persian jerd, hoarding seeds and flower heads in its tunnels, could produce exactly such clumps. Others suggested the excavators themselves might have tracked the pollen in. The evidence that moved the world might be the work of a small mammal or a worker's boot. That too has to be granted. So, a new generation went back. From 2014, a team led by Graham Barker of Cambridge reopened Selecki's old trench, and the paleoanthropologist Emma Pomeroy, joining in 2016, found something no one expected: the crushed skull and torso of another Neanderthal lying directly beside where Shanidar 4 had been lifted out in a block of soil decades earlier. They named the individual Shanidar Z and published the find in Antiquity in 2020. The new excavation suggested these bodies had been placed in a channel in the cave floor that had been intentionally dug deeper to receive them, and that a prominent rock beside the head may have served as a marker, a place returned to again and again across an unknown span of years to lay the dead. The flowers may never be proven, but the deeper truth survived the doubt and grew stronger. Whatever the pollen was, the Neanderthals of Shanidar were carrying their dead to a particular place in a particular cave, digging to receive them, marking the spot, and coming back. They had a place for the dead. They returned to it. Ralph Selecki died in 2019 at the age of 101, never able to settle the question that had defined his life. We share roughly 2% of our DNA with these people, and in some sense, they never fully left us. What Shanidar suggests is that the impulse running through this entire list, the refusal to simply abandon the dead, may be older than our species. It may belong to a different kind of human who walked the earth before us, who grieved in a language we will never hear in the dark of a cave 70,000 years gone. Number 3. The Pit of Bones and the oldest funeral we have ever found. In the Atapuerca hills of north-central Spain, deep inside a cave system, reached only by crawling through narrow passages and then descending a vertical shaft roughly 13 meters straight down. There's a chamber that archaeologists call the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones. It is one of the most important fossil sites on Earth, and it may hold evidence of mortuary ritual so ancient that it reaches back beyond our own species, beyond the Neanderthals, to a human ancestor who lived nearly 500,000 years ago. At the bottom of that shaft, excavators working under Juan Luis Arzuaga, Eudald Carbonell, and José María Bermúdez de Castro have recovered the remains of at least 28 individuals, thousands upon thousands of bone fragments belonging to a population of Homo heidelbergensis, an archaic human that sits near the root of the Neanderthal line. The bones have been dated to around 430,000 years old. To say that number aloud is to lose your footing on it. 430,000 years. Our own species would not exist for roughly another 100,000 years after these people died. And here is the central mystery of the pit. How did 28 bodies come to rest at the bottom of a sealed vertical shaft, deep inside a cave, in a place no one would casually fall into, and no animal would naturally drag prey? The composition of the dead points away from accident. There are very few infants and very few of the elderly. Instead, the assemblage is dominated by adolescents and young adults, which is not the pattern of a natural death trap, but the pattern of selection. The completeness of the skeletons suggests the bodies arrived whole as corpses, not as scattered scavenged remains. The evidence indicates in the careful words of the researchers that these bodies were deliberately placed there, carried or dropped down the shaft on purpose. And then there is the single most evocative object in all of human prehistory. Among the hundreds of thousands of bones, the excavators found exactly one stone tool. 1. It is a beautifully made hand axe, worked on both faces, fashioned from a rare reddish quartzite that does not match the ordinary stone of the site. It is the only artifact of its kind in the entire deposit. The team named it Excalibur. The single axe is where this becomes more than a pit of bones. Carbonell and his colleague Marina Mosquera argued in the journal Comptes Rendus Pallavol in 2006 that the deliberate deposition of the bodies combined with this one exceptional object of striking color placed among them, and nothing else points to symbolic behavior to the earliest mortuary practice in the human record, pushing the origins of ritual treatment of the dead back some 300,000 years earlier than almost anyone had been willing to believe. A grave offering, a single beautiful thing chosen for its color given to the dead before our species was even born. This interpretation is of course contested. Some argue the chamber could have been a natural trap, that Excalibur could have arrived by chance, that we are reading meaning into accident across an unimaginable gulf of time. The doubt is fair. The proof is gone dissolved by 400 millennia. But stand at the edge of that interpretation and look at what is required to dismiss it. 28 bodies carried into the deepest dark, dominated by the young, accompanied by one perfect red axe, and nothing else. If that is meaningless, it is a meaninglessness that looks exactly like grief. Nearly 500,000 years ago, in the heart of a Spanish hill, something that was not yet us may have looked at its dead and refused to let them go without a gift. Certainty will not come here. The not knowing is the oldest silence there is. Number 2. Dolni Vestonice and the 3 who were buried touching. In the spring of 1986, near a village called Dolni Vestonice in Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic, the archaeologist Bohuslav Klima uncovered a grave that has refused to be explained for nearly 40 years. It belongs to the Gravettian period of the Upper Paleolithic, around 30,000 years ago, in the era of the great mammoth hunters of Ice Age Europe. And it contains 3 young people buried together, arranged in a tableau so deliberate and so strange that every attempt to read it has only deepened the riddle. 3 bodies, all of them, young, between roughly 16 and 25 years old. They were laid in a single grave and positioned with evident care. The individual on the left lay on his back, his head turned toward the body in the center, and his hand had been placed deliberately across the central body's pelvis. The body in the center lay on its back, and the individual on the right lay face down, turned away his arm, reaching toward the others. Red ochre, the pigment that recurs in human burial across the deep past, had been scattered over the heads of all 3, and concentrated heavily over the pelvis of the figure in the middle. The central figure is the heart of the mystery. This person's skeleton shows a genetic pathology, a developmental condition that left the legs curved and malformed, and the bones marked by other anomalies. This was someone who would have looked different in life, who moved through the world in a body that set them apart. And for a long time, the central figure was believed to be a woman, which gave rise to the interpretations that have haunted the site, a love triangle frozen in death. 2 men flanking a woman, or a childbirth gone fatally wrong, with the hand on the ochre-stained pelvis, as a gesture toward the place where life and death had met. There is even a wooden stake driven through the hip of the figure on the left, a sign perhaps of a violent end or of some rite we cannot reconstruct. The modern evidence dismantles those old stories and leaves something stranger in their place. 2 lines of analysis have reshaped our understanding of who these 3 were. First, a kinship study published by Alt and colleagues in 1997 in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology found that all three shared a cluster of rare anatomical traits so unlikely to co-occur by chance that the individuals were almost certainly related in Ice Age family, laid to rest as one. And then ancient DNA complicated it further still, with analysis suggesting that all three may in fact have been male and biologically related, collapsing the love triangle reading entirely and leaving us with something we cannot interpret at all. Three related young men, one of them disabled, buried, touching drenched in ochre, one of them face down with a stake through his hip. We are left holding a scene we know was meaningful and cannot decode. Every element was chosen. The hand on the pelvis was placed by someone. The face-down body was turned by someone. The ochre was poured by someone. The stake was driven by someone. 30,000 years ago, people stood over this grave and arranged these three young bodies into a specific and intentional composition. And then they covered it over, and the meaning went into the ground with them. The hand still rests on the pelvis. The face is still turned away. We can see exactly what they did in perfect detail, and will never learn what it meant. They left us a sentence in a language with no other words. Number 1, Mungo Lady, and the fire on the far side of the world. In 1968, a geologist named Jim Bowler was riding a motorbike across the eroding dunes of a long, dry lakebed in the far west of New South Wales, in the Australian outback, studying the ancient climate written in the sediment. The place is called Lake Mungo, part of the Willandra Lakes, a landscape that has been bone dry for tens of thousands of years. And in the crumbling wall of a dune, Bowler saw fragments of burnt bone weathering out of the earth. He had found a woman. We call her Mungo Lady, and she would turn out to be the oldest cremation ever discovered anywhere on the planet. When Bowler returned with archaeologists the following year, they pieced together what had happened to her. Her body had been burned. Then her bones had been crushed. Then the crushed burnt remains had been gathered and buried in the earth. This was not a body left to the elements. This was a deliberate multi-stage funerary rite carried out with intention and care. Years later in 1974, Bowler found a second burial 500 meters away. Mungo Man, an older man, laid out on his back, his hands folded together at his lap, his body sprinkled from head to foot with red ochre, the sand around him stained pink with it. And then came the dates. In 2003, Bowler and a team of researchers published in the journal Nature a careful consensus determination of the age of these two burials, drawing on 4 different dating methods and decades of stratigraphic work. The answer reshaped the human story of an entire continent. Mungo Lady and Mungo Man are roughly 40,000 to 42,000 years old. Hold that number against everything else in this list. Mungo Lady's cremation is older than Göbekli Tepe by 30,000 years. It is the oldest cremation on Earth. Mungo Man's ochre burial is among the oldest ceremonial burials of our species anywhere in the world. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. These rites were performed on the far side of the planet from every European and Near Eastern site we have walked through. While the ancestors of the people who would one day build Jericho and Sunghir were scattered across Africa and Asia, here on the other side of the Earth in the heart of Australia. 40,000 years ago, human beings were already cremating their dead, already grinding red ochre to anoint the body, already standing over a grave with the full weight of ceremony. And the truth of it is not its strangeness, but its familiarity. Everything else on this list has confronted us with rituals we cannot fully understand. Skulls hung from posts, bodies thrown into shafts, children buried under fortunes of ivory. This is something else. This is the recognition that the things we still do burning our dead, gathering the ashes, marking a body with color, and laying it down with care, are not recent inventions of civilization. They are not the product of religion, or cities, or writing, or any of it. They are older than all of that. They are nearly as old as our species' presence on this continent. The impulse to honor the dead, to refuse to simply walk away, predates everything we think of as human achievement. You have almost certainly stood at a graveside. You may have watched a body committed to fire, or carried ashes, or scattered them somewhere that mattered. When you did, you were not performing a modern act. You were doing something that a woman's people did for her on the shore of a lake in Australia 42,000 years ago. Burning her, gathering her, returning her to the earth because they could not bear to let her vanish without ceremony. The Aboriginal peoples of the Willandra, the Pakantai, the Muti Muti, and the Ngiyampa have always known their ancestors were there, and in recent years, Mungo Lady and Mungo Man were finally returned to the land they came from. Across every site we have walked through tonight, across 500,000 years, and the entire surface of the earth, the same thing keeps appearing in the ground. People who would not abandon their dead. People who carried them into caves, rebuilt their faces, painted them red, gave them gifts, returned to them, refused to forget. It is the one thread that runs unbroken through the whole of the human past, older than farming, older than language, as we know it older, very nearly than we are. Mungo Lady is the proof, lying in the red dust at the bottom of the world. The fire was lit 42,000 years ago, and in some quiet, essential way, it has never gone out. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.